Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Matt from Matt's Bookshelf, and today I have the privilege to talk about what will very likely be one of my favorite books of the year, and that is Dan Simmons' Hyperion. But before we do that, a little business to get out of the way first. I wrote another book. It's available on Amazon. It's a collection of short stories. I'll leave a link in the description below, so please check it out if it looks like something that could interest you. And also check out Film Prods with Colorless Wonderland. It's a podcast in which we look at a lot of movies from 2000s and on and try to decipher whether or not they will be modern classics. It's a very fun podcast. It's one of my favorite hobbies on the side, and I really wish that people would check it out more because both myself and Tyler are very proud of what we've accomplished here. But with that said, time to talk about some books. Hyperion was published in 1989. It won the Hugo for Best Book of the Year in the science fiction category, and since then Dan Simmons has kind of been a rock star of the science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction and horror fiction genre. The book takes place in the year 2732, in which three nations, one being the hegemony, which is the collection of human-run planets all springing out from old Earth after its collapse. There's the Technocore, which is an AI faction, a completely independent AI faction. And then there's the Ousters, which are humans, but they have evolved and shaped in weird ways because they live far out in the galaxy, usually out in space, so their bodies have more from the gravity change. And currently, at the start of the novel, the Ousters are about to invade a planet called Hyperion, which is part of the hegemony, but it's far out on the outskirts of their domain. So they do have these things called farcasters, which allow people to teleport instantaneously to different planets in the hegemony, but some planets are so far away that they need space travel in order to get there, and Hyperion is one of those planets. And so as the hegemony prepares to defend their nation against the Ousters, at the same time, a pilgrimage is going on in Hyperion, and these pilgrimages are frequent, but this is considered to be the last one likely of the planet before it's ruined by war, in which 7 pilgrims go to the Time Tombs, which is this mythological place that is protected by an even more legendary and mythological figure called the Shrike, this being that is made entirely of sharp metal. We follow these pilgrims as they land on Hyperion and make their pilgrimage to the Time Tombs, and we learn about them along the way. Each one shares their story during the pilgrimage, and you learn through their accounts so much about this fascinating world that Dan Simmons has created, as well as dive deep into incredibly fascinating characters. Hyperion is going to be one of the best books I've read this year, mainly because of its amazing character work. Of the 7 characters, each one has a completely unique backstory. Each one has a very unique relationship with the Shrike. And what is so impressive about this novel is there's not a whole lot of info dumping with the galaxy he's created. You learn it through the different perspectives of the characters naturally and how they tell their stories. Each character is given almost 100 pages to tell their story as well, so you learn so much about the setting, you know so much about them, and each character just gives you so much more valuable information about this world. Through the Consle, you learn about the hegemony. Through Bron Lamia, who's a detective, you learn about the Technocore. Through Kassad, who's this veteran and legendary soldier in the hegemony, you learn about the Ousters. And each character shows more depth to the world of Hyperion, shows more depth and more scary reveals about the Shrike itself, the monster. They all have a secret relationship with that each one reveals by the end of their accounts. And even those lore aspects aside, each character is just very fascinating and has a unique story from a science fiction standpoint. Each is kind of like a short story in a way, but they're all so fun and also kind of tragic in the same way. And as the characters reveal things about the Shrike and about the galaxy at large, they also reveal things about the planet of Hyperion, which is just such an amazing planet to me. It's one of my favorite settings now across fiction. And even from the earlier descriptions, which are more broadly geographically based, where you first get Father Hoyt's perspective, who is this young priest currently going through chemotherapy. He's suffering from cancer. But when he tells his story, it's not his story. It's actually the diary of another priest who he was close to. And I'm going to read the first introductory to the town of Keats and where this priest lands, because he's an outcast because he was trying to use fake evidence to prove the existence of Jesus, and so was outcast by the church, and then has been forced to the planet of Hyperion. So I'll read that section as followed as well, because I think it's some very beautiful and descriptive prose. Planetfall Keats, in hours of effort getting through customs and taking ground transit into the city. Confused images, the mountain range to the north with its shifting blue haze, foothills forested with orange and yellow trees, pale sky with its green-blue undercoating, the sun too small but more brilliant than Paysum's. Colors seem more vivid from a distance, dissolving and scattering as one approaches, like a pointillist palette. The great sculpture of sad King Billy, which I had heard so much about, was oddly disappointing. Seen from the highway, it looked raw and rough, a hasty sketch chiseled from the dark mountain, rather than the regal figure I had expected. It does brood over the ramshackle city of 500,000 people in a way that the neurotic poet king probably would have appreciated. Apart from the more lavish prose that also does so much great world building for what Keats and what Hyperion are, because the city of Keats was designed to be this like safe haven for writers and artists. And at one point, the diarist says that Hyperion is a poet's city devoid of poetry. And just lines like that really hit. Dan Simmons proves to be incredibly well read. Keats, the city, is an obvious reference to the poet John Keats, who also makes an appearance in this book as well as like an AI recreation of his mind. Keats wrote the poem Hyperion, but also there's the Canterbury Tales analogies as well, because it's the travelers all going to a destination, telling their story along the way. Later on, which I'll get to, historical references as well. It really doesn't shy away from looking at the past of the brutal nature of conquest and colonization, and applying that to the hegemony and how it spread across the galaxy into all these multiple planets. It doesn't shy away from like the brutality that is there. To really hit home the uniqueness of the characters and their plots, their writing styles are also very fundamentally different too. For Cassade's writing style, you have of extreme emphasis on like military tech and fighting. His story is very interesting because he goes to these combat simulations, and within all these simulations, so he's going like across history and time. Like at one point he's fighting with like King Henry, and then another point he's fighting in like a future event. He keeps seeing this woman in all the simulations that keeps uniting with him, and trying to explain that was, the mystery around that was very satisfying to me. And when he finally meets the Shrike, the brutality of and the capabilities of the Shrike really make it seem like it is this impossible to overcome antagonist. That's really the strongest point of this novel, is that the Shrike, this legendary monster, feels legendary and it feels scary, and even though you learn more about it with each subsequent narration from the characters, it only becomes more difficult to understand. It becomes more impossible to even imagine them defeating, because it's literally unkillable, at least how it seems like in this first novel. But it seems like Dan Simmons' prose really shines with the Martin Silenus character, who is the writer. There's so many like funny lines, and the prose really is at its best with Martin Silenus. He has like this really dark, cynical wit to him. And even like the broader scientific elements are set aside to a certain extent to really make this character seem so human. As a writer myself, I really did appreciate some of his lines here that I could relate to, even though this character is larger than life. At one point he says, "Belief in one's identity as a poet or writer prior to the acid test of publication is as naive and harmless as the youthful belief in one's immortality. And the inevitable disillusionment is just as painful." It hits different. It really grounds the characters in reality. And later on, he makes a parable to the events of his backstory to that of Beowulf. And again, Dan Simmons is just so well read that he takes real world aspects of our present day and applies them to a time that's almost 1,000 years in the future, and it just grounds everything in reality for me. And best of all, Martin Silenus credits William Gass as being the best writer of his time. And as someone who loves recognitions and has read William Gass on William Gaddis, I was like, hell yeah, I love Martin Silenus so much. The saddest story for me, and the story I was probably most interested in, was Sol Weintraub's story. It very much follows like this Benjamin Button-esque tale in which his daughter is an archaeologist working on the time tombs. She gets caught in this trap, and when she comes back, she's infected with this disease that is causing her to age backwards. So she's about 30 or like in her late 20s when she's working on the tombs, and when she comes back, she starts to de-age. And it's a long story, but it's drawn out purposefully because you're watching her digress in age. Every day she gets a day younger, and to be able to track that, and the patience Simmons has to tell the story as slowly as it did really hits home the tragedy of it. And so you have Sol at the beginning of the book carrying his baby around with him. He's an older man, he's an academic, and you realize that he's just so desperate to confront the strike one more time to maybe find a solution that will help her daughter, prevent her daughter from dying by aging in reverse. It's just really touching, and all the stories are so unique. Like Bronnie Lamia, who's the detective, she's the only girl on this trip, on this voyage, and hers is like this story where she meets the AI recreation of John Keats and learns more about the Technocore, which is that nation completely ruled by AI and what their sinister motivations are, potentially pitting the ousters and the hegemony against each other. And then finally you have the Consle, who is the last character you get perspective of, and who's kind of like the narrator of all the side stories, as like who's the narrator of the pilgrimage. Basically, you get the narration of each character when they tell their story, but between those excerpts where they're just traveling through Hyperion, you're getting the Consle story. And he's like this secret agent, double agent, who originally is with the hegemony, is responsible for so many tragedies, and both talked about with the ousters against hegemony and also completely washed away, such as the hegemony's colonization of different planets and the massacres he's witnessed as they kick out, as they kill all the natives of the planet so they can settle their own people there. He makes a really interesting observation at the end, because old Earth is completely gone at this point, and the ousters, who are that crazy group of humans who all live in space, are kind of looked at as savages throughout most of the novel and through hegemonic propaganda as well. But he has a different perspective of it. He sees the hegemony as the outdated nation, and he sees the ousters as the future. And I want to read that section because I did really feel like it's fascinating, and also a testament to how Dan Simmons pulls real history in order to create his own world. I will not try to describe the beauty of life in a swarm. Their zero-gravity globe cities and comet farms and thrust clusters, their micro-orbital forests and migrating river, and the 10,000 colors and textures of life at Rendezvous Week. Suffice it to say that I believe the ousters have done what web humanity has not in the past millennia: evolved. While we live in our derivative cultures, pale reflections of old Earth life, the ousters have explored new dimensions of aesthetics and ethics and biosciences and art, and all the things that must change and grow to reflect the human soul. Barbarians, we call them, while all the while we timidly cling to our web like Visigoths crouching in the ruins of Rome's faded glory and proclaim ourselves civilized. So great. And that's where basically the novel ends. They are pretty much on the doorstep of the time tombs, about to confront the strike, and meanwhile the ousters have invaded Hyperion. It's a long book, and ultimately there's so many more questions that need to be answered, but really Dan Simmons makes a novel that's kind of undeniable, and kind of undeniable that I want to read the next book as well, which I already have, and I'm going to be reading like within the next week. So that's my video. I hope that I have enticed you to read Hyperion. I loved it, if you couldn't tell from this video, and I'm looking forward to reading much more by Dan Simmons, including the next book, which I will very likely do a video on as well once I'm finished, even though it is even longer than this book. So thank you if you made it this far, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thank you, and goodbye.